They told you the convent was holy, a place of silence and prayer. But what if I told you that beneath the hymns and candlelight, something else was happening? That behind those stone walls, women in veils whispered in tongues not heard since Babylon, conducting rites, not prayers, and burying truths so dark the Vatican itself sealed them in silence. You've heard of haunted houses, but you've never heard of haunted virtue. In 1871, in the rural outskirts of Missouri, a group of Masons discovered an underground chamber beneath a collapsed convent chapel. What they found wasn't just structural decay, it was skeletal remains. Small, disfigured, dozens of them, some still wearing rosaries clutched in tiny broken hands. The convent, it was erased from the records. Not demolished, not condemned, simply vanished. And that wasn't the only one. From Pennsylvania to New Mexico, behind the curtain of the church's pious narrative, lies a string of forbidden convents, institutions where obedience meant silence and silence meant survival, places where girls as young as 12 were donated by their families to serve Christ and disappeared into a life of unspoken servitude. Some say they were saints, others whisper the truth, they were subjects. Subjects of experiments in obedience, in pain, in spiritual possession. You think that's extreme? Consider this. If you control a soul at the moment it breaks, you own it for eternity. That's not just theology. That's architecture. That's how these places were built. Layered in symbolism, stained glass hiding codes, statues concealing keys, crypts beneath pews where not all the coffins were empty. The church claimed these were places of protection. But protection from what? From the world outside. Or the truth within. Because here's the secret. Not all nuns were victims. Some became something else. Something the church couldn't contain. Something still operating in the shadows today. And tonight, you'll see them. Over the next 4 hours, you're not just going to hear stories. You're going to descend, one layer at a time, into a history scrubbed from textbooks, cloaked in scripture, and held in place by fear. This is America's forbidden convent history. And once you hear it, you'll never walk past a chapel the same way again. You're not watching this by accident. Now lean in. You're being initiated. The veil was never meant to keep the world out. It was meant to keep the truth in. In 1834, a convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts, burned to the ground. Official records blamed a mob, anti-Catholic rage, they said. But the documents from inside the diocese tell a different story. For weeks before the fire, whispers leaked out from within the cloister, girls disappearing, nuns locked in isolation, an older mother superior who hadn't spoken in years suddenly chanting in Latin at midnight. When the flames consumed the convent, the church called it a tragedy, but those close to it, those who escaped, called it justice. One girl, only known as Claire, spoke in court before disappearing forever. She claimed she saw a ritual beneath the convent's altar, hooded figures, a girl tied down, candles arranged in a symbol she said, felt older than God. The judge struck her words from the record. The priests labeled her possessed. But the fire that followed was no coincidence. Understand, this convents weren't just places of silence. They were laboratories of control, psychological obedience, repression of self, destruction of ego, submission to hierarchy, no matter how cruel, no matter how unnatural. The church called it purification, but what were they purifying, and who gave them the authority? They tested limits, they broke wills. And when a nun couldn't be broken, they didn't release her. They buried her. Spiritually or literally. Both happened. Think of how the system worked. A young girl, isolated from the world, stripped of her name, her voice, her desires, made to confess things she hadn't done, told she was sinful by design, then kept under strict silence, light deprivation, even starvation, masked as fasting. This wasn't just devotion, this was programming. And then came the visions. Many of the most miraculous visions reported in American convents came from women after weeks of sensory deprivation. Bleeding eyes, floating icons, voices in the walls, but instead of questioning their sanity, the church called it divine. And the spectacle only deepened the control. This isn't fiction. These records exist. In sealed archives, in abandoned convents surrounded by barbed wire, in the Vatican's restricted vaults, labeled simply, Pericolosa. You're not here for comfort. You're here for clarity. And clarity is dangerous. Keep watching. You're already deeper than most men ever dare to go. They called it the rule of silence. A sacred vow, they said. But beneath that vow lay something more primitive, more effective, a psychological stranglehold. Because when you take away a person's voice long enough, something happens to the mind. The silence begins to echo, and the only voice left is the one fed to you by your captor. In the cloistered halls of the St. Gertrude Convent in 1849, New Orleans, young novices were locked into what was called the chamber of discipline. No light, no windows. A stone cell buried beneath the chapel. It wasn't punishment. It was formation. Some stayed for 3 days, some for 30. The longer they stayed, the less they spoke, even after they came out. And some never came out at all. We're taught that silence is holy. But in the context of power, silence becomes a tool, a weapon. Because what you can't say, you eventually can't think. And what you can't think, you can't escape. And here's the darkest part: this system wasn't a glitch. It was by design. The church, like all empires, understood that control begins not with the body but with belief. And convents were the testing grounds. The earliest reports show it clearly. Women isolated for decades, told their thoughts were sins, their dreams were prideful, and their instincts were demonic. Obey, confess, submit, repeat. But not every nun obeyed. Some resisted. Some remembered who they were. And those were the ones who vanished. Quietly transferred, quietly exorcised, quietly eliminated. Let's talk about Sister Lenora. In 1911, she was found dead in the garden of a secluded convent in Idaho. They said it was suicide. But her letters, hidden in the binding of a psalter discovered a century later, tell a different tale. She wrote about dreams, lucid, recurring, of women buried alive beneath the floorboards, of a bell tower that rang at night, though the bell was long broken, of rituals where black-robed figures held candles in the shape of a serpent's eye. She said something was feeding off the silence. And then she wrote one final phrase: "If you are reading this, they didn't find it? That means it's not over? And it isn't? Because what began in those convents didn't stay there. The methods evolved, spread, institutionalized, and today, the silence takes a different form. Keep going. Every truth we uncover from here on out strips away the illusion, layer by layer. Let me ask you something. Why do you think the Vatican owns more exorcism records than any other institution on earth? Why do you think so many of those cases trace back not to wild, possessed villagers, but to nuns, silent, obedient, cloistered women, suddenly speaking in ancient tongues, convulsing, predicting deaths before they happened? These weren't fairy tales. These were documented, sealed, hidden. Because they weren't just cases of demonic possession. They were symptoms of something deeper. A rupture in the mind, a breaking point, the cost of submission taken too far. But what happens when that fracture isn't the end? What if it's the door? In 1938, at the Sacred Sisters of Mercy in Vermont, 4 nuns were found kneeling in a circle in the garden, completely unresponsive, eyes open, silent, paralyzed. The chapel smelled of sulfur. Inside, the crucifix was inverted, and the walls had been carved with what experts later described as a dialect resembling pre-Aramaic script. The Vatican arrived in less than 24 hours. And within 3 days, the entire convent was abandoned, boarded, unmarked on maps. Today, if you drive out there, the forest has swallowed it whole. But the locals, they still hear hymns in the fog. This isn't just horror, it's protocol. When institutional control meets metaphysical boundaries, things break. The mind fractures, the soul rebels. And what bleeds through is not always metaphor. Convents were never just about prayer. They were labs. Psychological, spiritual, and possibly dimensional. Because when you isolate a person from reality, strip them of identity, autonomy, and language, you don't just create obedience. You create access. Access to what? That's the question they never want asked. Some of the oldest accounts from 18th century French cloisters describe visitations, shadows appearing during prayer, collective visions of burning cities, and whispers coming from statues that had no mouths. And when those stories crossed the ocean to America, the same patterns followed. We're taught to laugh at that. Call it madness. Call it myth. But ask yourself, why does madness follow the same blueprint across continents and centuries? Why do the symptoms of so-called demonic possession look suspiciously like the symptoms of trauma-based psychological breakdown? Because the systems are the same. Whether you call it a convent, a clinic, or a cult. And the deeper we go, the more we see it. A pattern, a method, a design. This isn't just about the past anymore. It's about what they're still doing today. There's a reason they hid the bodies. Not just because of guilt, but because of what the bodies could prove. You see, when a girl died in a convent, there was rarely a funeral. No grieving family, no gravestone, just a quiet disappearance explained away with a line in a ledger. Taken by illness, transferred, returned to God. But some families dug deeper. In 1894, a man named Elijah Braithwaite traveled from Kentucky to a cloistered convent in Ohio. His sister, Margaret, had been sent there by their mother. She was 16, healthy. He hadn't heard from her in over a year. Letters returned unopened. The Mother Superior told him Margaret had taken a vow of eternal silence and was no longer of this world. Elijah demanded proof. What he found was a cemetery behind the convent, hidden behind thornbrush. 37 unmarked graves, no birth records, no death certificates, just nameless, numbered stones. He exhumed one. The remains were small, too small, the pelvis shattered, teeth missing, jaw wired shut. He wrote about it in his journal. What I saw was not a burial. It was a cover-up. The earth was a vault, and the nuns were its keepers. That journal was confiscated by local clergy. It resurfaced 80 years later in a university archive. Margaret's name, still not found in church records. And this isn't a one-off. Go deep into old convent reports, and you'll find entire decades where mortality rates among young initiates were classified, redacted, or simply missing. Fires were common, earthquakes blamed for collapsed halls. But it always seemed to happen right after a novice spoke out, accused a sister, questioned the rules, or claimed she saw something inhuman in the chapel basement. And those who survived, they didn't come back whole. They came back altered, dissociative, fearful of mirrors, terrified of bells. Ask yourself what kind of institution produces that kind of trauma. These weren't just women in veils. They were test subjects in a centuries-long experiment in mind control, spiritual suppression, and total identity collapse. Because when you take a person, strip their name, their voice, their memory, and replace it with ritual, you don't just create a servant. You create a vessel, and once that vessel is hollow enough, anything can move in. Now, you're starting to see. This isn't about faith. It's about function. And the function is far darker than you've been led to believe. Let's talk about the Magdalene Protocol. A term you won't find in any official church doctrine, but whispered among archivists, buried in internal Vatican correspondence, and referenced, always vaguely, in inquiries that never made the news. It was never written for you. It was written for them, to manage the fallout when a nun broke formation, when a cloistered woman remembered who she was and tried to speak. Because here's the hidden truth, not all suppression was physical. Much of it was pharmacological. Starting in the late 1800s, convents received donations from pharmaceutical companies, tinctures, oils, remedies, labeled as stress relievers and anti-hysteria tonics. But dig into the chemical records, and you'll find high quantities of scopolamine, laudanum, and a compound referred to as Angelica noctis. These weren't medicines. They were suppressants, neurological inhibitors used to sedate the mind, dull memory, and amplify suggestibility. Why would women devoted to Christ need mind inhibitors? Because they weren't being healed. They were being erased. One former nun, interviewed anonymously in 1972, described what she called the black tea. It was administered before confession, before visions, before initiation into the inner chamber, where the real rituals took place. She said time would blur. Her body would move, but her mind would vanish. She remembered firelight, chants, a circle of veiled women not praying, but invoking, and always, at the center, figure with no face. The priests dismissed her story as trauma, but decades later, when investigators returned to that same convent, they found the underground room exactly as she described, unused for years. Smelled of ash and wax, symbols etched deep into the stone, not Christian, but pre-Christian, Babylonian, Sumerian, forgotten by time, preserved by ritual. The Magdalene Protocol was the Church's internal response to these moments of rupture. First, silence the subject. Second, rewrite the narrative. Third, if the rupture spreads, burn it down. A convent fire, a forgotten file, a lost testimony. And just like that, reality resets. And it worked. For decades. But now the cracks are showing. More survivors are speaking. More records are being unearthed. The veil is slipping. And with it the illusion. Because this isn't just about nuns. It's about every system that uses obedience to mask experimentation. It's about the hidden hand behind the ritual. The force that feeds on blind belief. You're not just watching history. You're staring into the machine that still runs today. And halfway down this rabbit hole, you've got a choice: keep going or look away. Because from here on out, everything changes. You've made it this far, so I'm going to give you something they never wanted you to hear. In 1903, a convent in North Dakota initiated a secret project, codenamed Corpus Veritas. Its goal, to create what they called perfect vessels. Young women stripped of personal memory, trained in total obedience, and then subjected to a series of esoteric rituals passed down through forbidden texts smuggled from pre-Inquisition Europe. These were not metaphorical rites, they were precise, mathematical. The same angles, the same symbols, the same incantations, performed under lunar alignments with surgical timing. Why? Because the Church wasn't just hiding demons. They were trying to summon something older, a force, a consciousness, a possession that didn't need to enter through invitation, but through design. The human soul, if broken and rebuilt properly, could serve as a gate. The nuns weren't just victims, they were the locks. And the rituals were the keys. Testimonies later recovered from a surviving assistant, hidden in a ciphered manuscript, described the moment the first gate opened. The girl stopped breathing for 7 minutes. Her body convulsed into a shape no bones should allow. And then, in dead silence, she stood, eyes black, mouth closed. But everyone in the room heard her voice, inside their heads. Then she dropped dead. The assistant said they buried her in the chapel floor and salted the walls. The convent was abandoned 3 months later. But today, satellite imagery shows that structure still exists, half swallowed by the earth, roof caved in, but the altar, still intact. Why preserve it? Because certain places remain active. And now we ask the real question, what was the church actually protecting us from? Sin, or access. Every institution built on domination, whether it's religious, governmental, or corporate, uses the same blueprint. Break the individual, rewrite identity, introduce symbolic hierarchy, and once the subject loses the ability to distinguish self from system, insert new code. And that code is still running, in education, in entertainment, in the church, and in every institution you were taught to trust. If you're still here, then you're ready for the next level. And I need you to comment something. To mark this moment of descent, the veil is broken. I see now. Say it twice. Out loud. Or in the comments. Because after this point, the transformation begins. And once you've seen it, you can't go back. There's a reason they call it a habit. That black and white veil draped over the nun's head. But the truth, it's not just clothing. It's a uniform, a signal, a psychological trigger. Because once you wear the same thing every day, speak the same words every hour, live the same silence every year, you become patterned. This isn't just spiritual discipline. It's behavioral conditioning, the kind pioneered long before psychology had a name. Pavlov taught dogs to salivate at a bell. The church taught girls to bow at a whisper. By the mid-20th century, psychologists began studying convents as closed behavioral systems. What they found disturbed them: indicators of long-term trauma, delusional beliefs reinforced by groupthink, and evidence of suppressed identity disorder. But the research? Defunded, classified. Why? Because they weren't just observing trauma. They were observing results. Let me be blunt. The convent was never about faith. It was a prototype for how to break the human soul and rebuild it in the image of the institution. Strip away your past, replace it with ritual, surround you with fear, then offer relief in exchange for total submission. And now look around you. Modern schools, therapy programs, even influencer culture, all echoes of the same method. The pattern repeats: 1. Isolate. 2. Break. 3. Recode. 4. Obey. Don't believe me? In 1966, a secret meeting was held between a Catholic order and a major pharmaceutical corporation. The memo, once redacted, now recovered, discussed scalable behavior modulation techniques originally developed in cloistered religious systems. Translation: how to take what worked in the convent and apply it to the public. Do you see it yet? The convent was the lab. You are the field test. Every symbol, every chant, every authority figure draped in white or black is part of a schema. A script that rewrites your will without your permission. And if you're wondering why nuns are so feared in nightmares, it's not just the veil. It's what they represent. Total submission, enforced through beauty and fear. The face of control, wearing mercy. And if you still think this ended in the 1900s, wait until you see what they built next. Convents without walls. Systems without names. Networks of power hidden in plain sight. Keep going. The next revelation will change everything you think you know about obedience. Let's talk about the silent network, an unofficial term, never acknowledged, but known by those who've studied the movement of clergy, funds, and personnel between religious institutions, psychiatric facilities, and private intelligence firms throughout the 20th century. Here's what they never told you. After World War II, a number of defunct convents across America were reclassified, not destroyed, not repurposed, but quietly transferred into the control of shadow organizations tied to psychological warfare research. Places like St. Callista's in northern Oregon or the reclusive Chapel of Satan, Bridget in rural Virginia, no public access, no press, and yet activity continued. Deliveries, power, security, surveillance? Why keep a dead convent alive? Because it wasn't dead, it evolved. The silent network wasn't just nuns praying in isolation anymore. It became a template, one exported into intelligence operations, cult programming, and institutional obedience training. That's not speculation. That's in declassified documents buried under projects like MK Ultra and Bluebird. They learned from the convents, from the hierarchy, the silence, the triggers, the dissociation rituals masked as religious ecstasy. They didn't abandon these systems, they weaponized them. In 1958, an anonymous whistleblower wrote to a senator, "What began as a spiritual formation has become a mechanism of psychological re-engineering. These women are being remade. Their faith is no longer theological, it's procedural. They obey because their minds have been formatted to confuse obedience with salvation." And who funded this evolution? Private families, black budget agencies, institutions with more interest in outcome than in ethics. Let me put it plainly, America's most forgotten convents didn't die. They were absorbed. Their teachings, especially on control, became infrastructure. Today, we see the result in fragmented ways: therapies that erase trauma by rewriting memory, educational systems that reward rote obedience over curiosity, digital cults that hook the vulnerable with ritualized language and dopamine-driven conformity. This is the postmodern convent. Invisible, ubiquitous, and perfectly legal, and the faces behind it, they don't wear veils anymore. They wear lab coats, uniforms, suits, and sometimes robes. Obedience is the new currency. And the silence you see in people's eyes today, it's not peace, it's programming. You're not paranoid, you're finally awake. And in the next chapter, we'll uncover how these systems recruited girls, not from poverty or piety, but through bloodlines. Yes, bloodlines. Because some vessels weren't chosen at random. They were bred. They always told you the convent was a calling, that the girls who entered those walls were chosen by God. But behind that holy language was selection, quiet, intentional, genetic. Because here's what they never taught you in school. Many of the girls recruited into America's most secretive convents weren't just spiritual idealists. They were the daughters of specific bloodlines, families with old European heritage, traced through ancient monastic orders, secret societies, and dynasties tied to both the church and the occult. And it wasn't just about obedience. It was about inheritance. In 1921, in the highlands of Vermont, the Sisters of Eternal Mercy accepted 12 new girls into cloister. All were under 16. All from unrelated families across the eastern seaboard. But when an independent scholar compared baptismal records, he discovered something chilling. All 12 girls descended from the same 4 bloodlines, traced back to a Benedictine sisterhood in 14th century Austria that was later disbanded after accusations of heresy and ritual sacrifice. This wasn't coincidence. It was targeted continuity. These girls weren't just being trained. They were being prepared. Their genetics mattered. Their minds, malleable, yes, but their blood, that was sacred currency. You see, ancient orders believed that certain lineages carried soul memory, fragments of ancestral knowledge that could be unlocked under the right conditions. Not taught, activated, and the convent was the chamber. The process was brutal isolation, starvation, repetition, punishment, ecstasy, and finally ritual. These weren't ceremonies of worship, they were spiritual surgeries, meant to break through the veil of consciousness and ignite something buried deep within the blood. Most failed, some died, but a few transformed. There are scattered records, always vague, always redacted, of young nuns displaying abilities that defy rational explanation, speaking languages they never learned, predicting events days before they occurred, and, in rare cases, changing appearance. The church called them miracles. But the internal memos used another term, phenotypic resonance event, a translation, genetic memory activation. This is not theology, this is engineering, and it didn't stop with one convent. It spread, quietly, systematically, to others across the country. Certain names began to reappear, certain families, certain traits, because once you find a lineage that opens the door, you don't close it, you replicate it, you breed it. Now tell me, how many convents were sanctuaries? And how many were breeding chambers for forbidden blood? We're going deeper. The next revelation will expose who orchestrated this, and how they kept the public asleep. Let's rip the mask off. You've heard of bishops, cardinals, the Vatican's hierarchy, but what if I told you those weren't the true architects? What if I told you that behind every convent, behind every cloistered wall of silence, there stood a hidden order? Older than Rome, invisible to history, and answerable only to itself? They're known in whispers as the Veiled Tribunal. Not a myth, not metaphor, a real council, comprised not of theologians or saints, but of blood-linked patriarchs and matriarchs from Europe's most ancient houses. Families that predate Christianity, houses that practiced esoteric rites long before Christ walked. And when the church rose to power, these houses didn't resist it. They infiltrated it. The Veiled Tribunal operated under a single objective: to preserve spiritual dominance through biological control. They didn't care about saving souls. They cared about studying them, how to fracture, rewrite, and overwrite the human psyche until obedience became instinctual. The convents were their laboratories. The nuns, their instruments, their daughters. Sometimes their property. In one recovered document from 1877, sealed with a triple cross insignia and found in the ruins of a convent fire in Illinois, the tribunal wrote, "The vessels must not remember, the silence must be generational. Through suffering the soul is purified. Through purification it becomes programmable. Only then may the gate remain open." That gate again. Always the gate. And what did they mean by programmable? Psychological conditioning, yes. But also spiritual formatting. They believed the soul was a coda, a resonance. And just like music, it could be retuned. If you hit the right frequencies through trauma, ritual, and repetition, you could erase original programming and insert your own. And who better to test that on than girls bound by vows? The veiled tribunal oversaw these systems from behind diplomatic immunity, ancient wealth, and ecclesiastical obscurity. They funded the fires when convents went too far. They relocated survivors. They rewrote the narratives. And to the public, they presented it all as sanctity. But make no mistake, what they practiced was dominion. Not of nations, of souls. This isn't fiction. These people existed. And may still. Because power this old doesn't die. It descends. And you've just stepped into the chamber where it hides. What's next? We expose how these rituals made their way into American intelligence. How your mind, right now, might already be under their influence. The transition from sacred to state didn't happen overnight. It began in the shadows, where it always does. But by the 1950s, something unholy was already underway. The rituals of the convent were being rebranded as science. Enter the CIA. Enter Project MK Ultra. Most people think MK Ultra was just about LSD and interrogation. They're wrong. That was the surface-level operation, the distraction. The real core of MK Ultra came from what they called spiritual trauma encoding, techniques directly borrowed from cloistered convents in the early 1900s, especially those that dealt with silence, isolation, ritual punishment, and induced dissociation. Yes, the church's most forbidden systems were exported into national intelligence. Why? Because obedience is power. And obedience under duress, that's ownership. Declassified documents reveal a chilling truth. At least 7 convents across the U.S. were used as covert test sites. Nuns who were retired from service, some in their 40s, some in their teens, were reassigned not to parishes, but to behavioral research centers funded by the Department of Defense. The logic was simple. If you can train a nun to renounce her family, her voice, and her mind in the name of God, then with the right tools, you can train anyone to serve any system, without question. Survivors reported being subjected to hypnotic suggestion, electroshock, sexual reprogramming masked as spiritual purging, and recursive prayer loops designed to fracture the psyche. These weren't experiments, they were implementations. One report, labeled Angel Sequence Phase 3, details a subject named Claire, a former novice nun, who, after 12 weeks of silent confinement and dissociation therapy, responded to 17 out of 20 command phrases without hesitation, even when they included self-harm, false memories, or foreign language insertion. And here's the part that should chill you. Those same phrases were later tested on children, in schools, in orphanages, in youth rehabilitation programs. The rituals of the convent had evolved into tools of control so subtle, so seamless, they didn't need a chapel anymore. They needed a classroom, a therapist's office, a screen. Because the greatest control isn't enforced through chains or cells. It's programmed into belief, into identity, into the voice inside your own mind. If you're still watching, you're not paranoid. You're waking up. The next layer will expose the final shift, how these systems moved beyond individuals and began targeting entire populations. Mass programming, mass obedience, mass silence, and how it all began with nuns. By the 1970s, the blueprint was complete. What began in medieval convents as ritual obedience had become a scalable system of control, one no longer limited to secluded chapels or hidden cloisters. It was now ready for mass deployment, across schools, media, government, and most dangerously, religion itself, not the ancient church, the modern one, because obedience had become invisible. And here's how they did it: by translating centuries of spiritual conditioning into cultural programming. Step 1: fracture identity. Divide the soul from the self, through confusion, trauma, overstimulation, and contradiction. The convent did it with silence and punishment. The modern world, it does it with information overload, moral relativism, and endless distraction. Step 2: replace the voice of instinct with the voice of authority. In convents, that was the Mother Superior. Today, it's the screen, the feed, the algorithm, the psychologist, the influencer, Anyone but you. Step 3. Ritualize obedience. They called it daily prayer. Now it's the morning scroll, the daily affirmation, the routine. Break it, and you feel guilt. Follow it, and you're rewarded. Dopamine as digital rosary. And step 4. Seal it with fear. Fear of exclusion. Fear of being wrong. Fear of punishment without cause. Just like the young girls once punished for dreams, thoughts, questions, you are now the novice. And the world, the new convent. Ask yourself why the language of the sacred keeps returning in secular form. Why we speak of followers, devotion, cancellation, purity, confession, and penance. These are not new terms. They are ritual echoes. The church never lost control. It outsourced it to media, to psychology, to the myth of progress. But the programming is the same: obey, submit, conform, and call it freedom. You see, the nuns were the first wave. They were the soil in which the seed of mass obedience was planted. They broke the minds of women to find out how to break the minds of men. And now, the harvest has begun. You look around and wonder why no one speaks truth anymore. Why everyone's afraid. Why silence is the new salvation. It's because the veil wasn't removed. It was digitized. And you're living inside the system it birthed. But if you're still here, then you're not inside it completely. You're watching the exit open. Keep going. The next revelation will show you how even resistance has been co-opted, and how to escape the system for real. You think rebellion makes you free. You think wearing black, shouting truth, questioning power means you've broken the system. But let me tell you the darkest secret of all: they engineered your rebellion too. The convents taught them everything they needed to know about false dissent. When a nun began to question the order, what did they do? They gave her a role, a space to vent. They made her the spirited one, the troubled but special sister. She felt unique, heard, important, and in that space they studied her, documented her resistance, learned from it. Then they turned it into policy, weaponized it against the next generation. Now apply that same model to modern culture. When you post the truth, when you rage online, when you scream at corruption, they're not afraid. They're listening. They're recording. They're building the next algorithm off of your passion. You're not dismantling the system, you're training it. Every protest becomes a data set. Every act of rebellion becomes predictable. And what is predictable is controllable. The most dangerous thing you can do in this world is go off script entirely. Not just rage against the machine, but step outside its framework altogether. That's what the forbidden convents feared the most. Not heresy, not rebellion, but transcendence. A nun who found her own inner law, her own code. A woman who could sit in silence and see the machinery for what it truly was. They locked those women in underground rooms. They erased them from the ledgers. They called them mad or mystics, or worse, possessed. But now, in this era, the same fate awaits any man who breaks the matrix. You'll be called insane, dangerous, toxic. A threat? Because you didn't just scream at the system. You walked out of it. And that's what I'm showing you how to do. Now listen carefully. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer anymore. Comment the phrase, "The veil was the mirror." Type it twice. Not for me, for you. It's the ritual of identity transformation. It marks you as awake, not just another rebel, but one who sees the gears behind the curtain. We're not done yet. The final descent is where the oldest secrets live, the ones they buried in bone. And the moment you hear them, you'll never sleep the same again. In a forgotten valley of Pennsylvania, beneath the ruins of a cloister torched during the winter of 1891, they found it, an ossuary, sealed in mortar containing not just bones, but ritual diagrams carved into femurs, prayer books inked in blood, and veils stitched with human hair. This was no burial ground, it was a prison. The women interred there hadn't died naturally. They had been silenced. These were not mere nuns. They were initiates. Spiritual radicals. Practitioners of something older than Catholicism. Older than the church itself. Older than even the spoken name of God. They had found the crack in the doctrine. And the church sealed it shut with their flesh. And here's the truth no one dares say aloud: the convent system, especially in 19th century America, was never purely religious. It was a containment system. When certain women began displaying mystical symptoms, dreams of knowledge they couldn't have known, languages they never learned, voices that echoed in ancient tones, the church labeled it hysteria, or worse, possession. But behind closed doors, bishops didn't exorcise them. They studied them. Because this wasn't madness, it was access to something beyond control, beyond canon, beyond Rome. These women could see across timelines. Some could speak names of men they'd never met. Others recited dead languages with impossible fluency. They weren't nuns anymore. They were threats to the structure. The Vatican sent silence teams, yes, they existed, to erase them. And the American convents became dumping grounds for spiritual anomalies. But before their final breath, these women did something the church never predicted. They hid their knowledge. Not in books, not in stone, but in ritual acts, movements, breathwork, veiled gestures done at dusk, repeated under moonlight. If you've ever seen an old nun sitting silently, making strange signs with her hands, you've seen it. That's not dementia. That's a language, a secret past without words. And some of you've seen it too. In dreams, in flashes, in patterns that tug at the edges of your waking life. This isn't coincidence, because those rituals were designed to echo forward, to call the next generation of awakened minds. And if you're hearing this now, it might be you. But tread carefully, because what they tried to bury isn't dead, it's waiting. The Vatican archives hold more than papal decrees and theological musings. Beneath their polished corridors lies a sublevel not listed on any public blueprint. Archivum Tenebris, the archive of shadows. And deep within it reels of silent film, black and white footage dated between 1910 and 1932, all labeled with one word, Contubernia.
Your translation?
The Forbidden Sisterhood? These reels were never meant to be seen. Shot under orders from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, they document what the Church referred to only as spiritual abnormalities in American cloisters. What they captured defies all doctrine. In one film, a group of nuns moves in synchronized spirals around a circle of salt, heads tilted skyward, mouths moving in complete silence. Yet the camera's recorded sound, whispering, multi-layered, ancient, some of it recognizable as Aramaic, other parts, unknown. Unmapped, another reel shows a woman levitating inches above her bed, eyes wide, pupils missing, as three sisters pray with backs turned. Not to the crucifix, but to a mirror covered in ash. And in the most disturbing footage of all, a group of nuns gathered around a child, not to bless, but to bind. They draw symbols in oil upon her skin, whispering, not to God, but to she who was denied. The child does not cry, she speaks back in tongues. All of this footage was sealed. The priests who filmed it were reassigned or disappeared. And the convents where it took place, every one was accidentally lost to fire, flood, or bankruptcy. Why? Because the church could not contain what had begun. They had stumbled onto a vein of knowledge older than Christendom itself. Practices carried across oceans, hidden beneath habits, woven into psalms sung just out of sync with Rome. These women had decoded the system, they had cracked the cage. And once you break a spell of control, even briefly, it cannot be forgotten. It burns, it lingers. Some say those films still exist, others claim they were destroyed, but more frightening is the possibility that someone, some secret faction, kept them, not for preservation, but for continuation. Because rituals don't need faith to function. Only repetition, only memory, and when memory returns across bloodlines, across dreams, across shadows, the power that was buried awakens. The deeper you descend into this history, the more obvious it becomes. This was never just about faith. It was never about piety, poverty, or divine service. It was about control. And the convent was the perfect machine. Behind stone walls, the church didn't just hide women, it erased them. Identity, ambition, ancestry, scrubbed clean. Once inside, a nun no longer had a surname. No past. No property. She belonged to God, yes, but more accurately to a system that fed off her silence. But silence is dangerous. It is not the absence of sound. It is the accumulation of pressure. And in those sealed convents, pressure built for decades. There are stories of the Black Chapel, a chamber said to exist beneath certain mother houses. No windows, no crucifixes, just a mirror. A mirror said to show not your reflection, but the true nature of the institution you served. Sisters were sent there when they began asking questions. The questions weren't always spoken aloud. Some just paused too long before the Eucharist. Others dreamt too vividly. Some simply disobeyed an order, but not in rebellion, in curiosity. And curiosity was always the first crack. Those who returned from the Black Chapel were changed. Not broken, rewritten. Their gaze no longer lingered, their speech became mechanical. One sister described them as living novenas, but hollowed. Another whispered, they wear skin like a garment, but it doesn't quite fit anymore. What if the church wasn't purging heresy, but engineering it? What if the most devout were chosen for manipulation? Not to serve God, but to feed a different altar? The convent was an ideal test site. No outsiders, no men. No oversight, the perfect breeding ground for psychological and spiritual experimentation under the guise of faith. MK Ultra, you think that was the beginning? It was merely the American echo of a much older chorus. One written in Latin, whispered by candlelight and perfected by women no one would believe. Because who listens to nuns? Who believes their madness, their visions, their deaths? No one. And that was the design. But now that you've seen behind the veil, ask yourself this. What else was never meant to be remembered? And what happens when the forgotten starts to remember itself? Now listen closely, because this is the part they hoped would never survive. In the archives of St. Aveline's Convent, hidden beneath 3 false floors and sealed behind iron blessed by exorcists, a ledger was discovered. Not by accident, by blood. The building had collapsed during a seismic tremor in 1978. Fire crews found it during recovery efforts. But when the Vatican arrived 2 days later, the reports changed. The ledger vanished. It contained names, dates, rituals, blood rites, not in Latin, in code. Ciphers older than the church itself. There were diagrams of women's bodies mapped like temples, with annotations suggesting specific organs corresponded to celestial influence and demonic filtration. Some bodies were marked as opened, others as sealed vessels. Pages described the extraction of ancestral memory and how trauma preserved spiritual data. Do you understand what that means? They weren't just controlling these women, they were harvesting something. And convents weren't just prisons, they were laboratories. This ledger referenced 37 silent convents across America. Remote, hidden, never registered on public diocesan maps, each one labeled with a glyph, a twisted cruciform spiral, called the Sigil of Binding Light. That symbol shows up again in private Vatican records during the Cold War, and even more disturbingly, on recovered items from underground structures in New Mexico, beneath defunct asylums with no paper trail. The pattern isn't religious, it's ritualistic infrastructure, a network. And that network was designed for something more than obedience. It was designed to fracture the divine, to splinter human essence and reforge it. You weren't meant to hear this, but now that you have, you can't unhear it. And that's the point. This isn't just history, it's a mirror, and every man who stares into it must decide, will you forget, or will you descend deeper? Now, if you've made it this far, comment, the light was a trap, twice, not just to engage, but to lock this into your psyche, cement the shift, signal to the algorithm, and more importantly, to yourself, that something in you has changed. Because it has. And when the silence finally breaks, you'll know. The nuns were never just servants. They were the gatekeepers of something ancient. And now you're standing at the gate,